So we have a lot of different invertebrate in Hawaii that benefit the native plants that we looked at. The first was the yellow-faced bee that we were talking about. So a lot of these insects, you know, came here naturally, either floating on the jet streams or maybe on debris that's floating on the ocean. Majority of the insects though, they're either on, if it's not the wind, then it's on feathers of birds. There's even snails that when eaten by birds could survive the digestive tract. They have what's called a foot on the bottom of the shell. Kind of like pipipis, smaller seashells, invertebrates that you might see. It's a hard foot, kind of like the material of your fingernail that closes the invertebrate inside its shell and protects it from being devoured, but also from the acids of certain birds. So through that way, a lot of insects came to Hawaii naturally and evolved with our plants. And they kind of had a relationship, call it a symbiotic relationship, where one needs the other to succeed. But once man came, colonized Hawaii and brought a lot of new species of plant and wildlife, but also their ships, and in the crates had a lot of critters, insects, a lot of rats, mongoose, cat and dog as well. All of them were stowed away and eventually had an impact on our native ecosystems and our native plants. They either feed on the plant, they could infect the plant, causing a disease, or they compete with our native insects or feed on the native insect. For example, if we open this, one introduced insect that we're all familiar with, hopefully nobody experienced it, sting, is the centipede. So these guys here were also introduced, and they easily will feed, you know, it's a predator, so it'll feed on almost any insect and take advantage of what it has in front of it. Sometimes even smaller lizards, small geckos, depending on the size of the forest centipede. The largest that can grow can be anywhere from 10 to 14 inches. And that's the large forest centipede. And I've seen these wrap around trees. It looks like a huge snake. These guys are really ferocious and a nasty pest that was introduced to Hawaii. All the insects you see in here are actually introduced. They all came for different reasons. Some were even brought in to control another pest, and in that failed. So we have to be really selective and do our research if you're trying to introduce something that's not from Hawaii to control an existing pest. We call that biocontrol. If we see here, we have some of our bees that are introduced to Hawaii. The two on the side are larger, you know, we know them as bumblebees, but this small guy in the center, this is actually the yellow-faced bee. So the yellow-faced bee, the male actually has yellow face, the rest of the body is all black. The female is all black, and you can see it, they're pretty much no larger than a grain of rice. A grain of rice might be larger than a yellow-faced bee. And these guys look like tiny flies, and they feed on the nectar from the ojai we were showing you, limas, and they actually choose the heliotrope tree. Don't have one here, but it's a non-native tree that they bury into the sticks. They bury into any pukas that are inside the sticks, and if not the heliotrope or naupaka sticks, then they'll also lay their eggs inside of pukas of rock. So either corals that you might find on the beach or larger pohaku that's also on the shore. That's why it's important also not to disturb a lot of these natural areas like stones. People use them to build fire rings for bonfires. You know, that can burn a whole nest if there's yellow-faced bee in there. These other predators though, or the other insects like the bees, they compete for habitat. So for the same nesting site, they might compete, the same flower as well. So all of these introduced bees, even though they pollinate other plants, for our yellow-faced bee in the center here, they're actually a problem for competing with our native species. You know, along the Waianae Mountains, there's other insects too. We have other families of butterfly. These guys again are non-native. And then these other ones that you have are moth. So different varieties of invertebrate. This one looks similar to a monarch. It's not exactly a monarch, but it does look similar to our native insect here. This is the pulelehua. or the Kamehameha butterfly. So you can see it looks almost similar, but you can tell that the pula lehua, or the Kamehameha butterfly, has much more black, and the orange is darker. They're more common. If you're trying to identify it, they have these 3 white spots. Even though this looks a little double, etymologists who study insects, scientists that study insects, note it by having these 3 dots on the black tips of the wings. That's one way to tell the difference. So you look at these guys, they don't have enough black on the bottom of their wings or the top, and then their 3 dots of white, there seems like there's only 2 on here. So this would not be the Kamehameha butterfly. So this species is really important because it's specific to a certain native plant, the mamaki plant. You can kind of see it in the background. It has these serrated edges, looks kind of like a saw, serrated, and these pink veins. This is the mamaki. Now the mamaki is another la'au plant that has medicinal use properties that are beneficial. Even today, a lot of us use that with tea. It's really calming. This guy though, he specifically chooses the mamaki to lay his eggs. Oh, and right behind here is a little picture of the caterpillar. See, this here protects them from any predators, but they specifically lay their eggs on the mamaki, and the caterpillar will bite an end of the mamaki leaf like a blanket, pull it over itself, and it would live inside of that curled leaf and kind of feed on the other side of the leaf. So it's protecting itself from any predators that may see it as a snap. So this is why it's important to take care of native plants, because there are native insects that are specific to those plants. So if we take out the native plant by introducing invasive species, by building too much, running over native plants, you're not only losing the native plant, but you're losing a native wildlife as well. So for this instance, the mamaki and the Kamehameha butterfly, the ohai, elimas, all the native plants we talked about, and the yellow-faced bee. The same goes for the ocean and the beach coastline. Now, you know, we like to use the beach for recreation. It's really important for fishing as well, and for resting, but it's also really important resting for the endangered Hawaiian monk seal. This is why it's important anytime we see a Hawaiian monk seal, we want to keep a distance with it. But also if you see any of these signs, it's also important to keep a faraway distance. When they're on the shore resting like this, just like us, they're relaxing. You know, majority of their time is spent at sea, but also they need to recuperate, re-energize. And by resting, it's really important for them, especially if it's a pregnant female. It's really important to give them their space, their time, and to be quiet near them so that we don't bother their rest. Specifically, if you have any dogs, that is important as well. Even on leash, we don't want to come in contact with the Hawaiian monk seals. You know, there's around 1,400 throughout the whole Kaʻena. That's the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and Hawaii. In Hawaii alone, there's only about 300 to 400, and here at Kaʻena, there's a good majority of that that actually return here frequently. From Kaʻena Point to Keawaula here on the west, and Mokuleia side on the north, there's a variety of repeat visitors that we have call this place home. This is why it's important to care for them by not only keeping our distance and your dogs away, but not driving on the beach, especially if we're trying to fish or look for an area to park. And we want to just keep our distance and stay respectful near these species. You know, besides them resting, and if they're pregnant, sometimes they're on the beach because they're molting. Now, your cat or your dog might shed their fur, but a monk seal, who is aquatic, when they come out, they develop a lot of algae on their fur. And like your dog or cat that sheds its fur, its dead fur, existing fur, and get a new coat, the monk seal is a mammal that also has to generate a new coat of fur. And what it does is, as the algae develops on it, it starts to rub on the sand, and as it swims, it also peels off the old fur. Now here we have some samples of its moat. The moat is when the fur comes off. So you can see the Hawaiian monk seal, of course we'd never be this close to it, But for research and education, we have some of its moat here. And we can see that it's very fibrous, almost like your cat or your dog. And then the underside is a little shorter. And this part would be connected to the skin on top. So it doesn't hurt them when it peels off, but it does cause the animal, when they're going through this process, to be very, very tired. This is why it's important as well for them to go through this process and develop a new set of a new coat and allow the moat to come off. So besides it being pregnant or resting, we have to give it space and time for it to properly molt. So the Hawaiian monk seal, one of two native mammals to Hawaii. The other is a native bat, the pe'ape'a, that's found on the Ko'olau mountain range, more than it is here on the Waianae range. But at Kaʻena here, we do have a lot of native avian species, bird species. And one that we have that's very, very important here is the moli, or the albatross. Now this is actually a skull of one that passed. So you can see the pukas here. This is the eye, this is the top beak of the albatross, if you can see it. And then the bottom jaw of the albatross is there as well. So this bird, look, it's almost as big as my hand. It's a very, very large bird. Its wingspan is 6 feet. It's huge. It's taller than me. And this bird is majority of the population of it is over here at Kaʻena Point. That's where it nests. And right now is a lot of chicks have hatched, and for quite some time the parents will take turns and go all the way up in the Pacific to feed on squid and tiny fish, and they'll bring back a lot of that fish and squid to the partner and to the chick. It'll be real nutritious for it. But even though we're surrounded by ocean, this animal chooses to feed way up in Alaska. So it's amazing how far it can go with effortlessly flying. But how does it get its water? You know, an animal surrounded and out at sea, how is it getting its water? The albatross, or moli as we say in Hawaiian, magnificent adaptation. Above its head is actually where a gland would be. It's a salt gland. So the animal can drink salt water. The water gets absorbed into the bloodstream. It goes to this duct that's above the eye. This is the eye socket. The duct is above the eye, and that salt would filter through that duct. And then there's a tube, a capillary or a tube, that would filter the salt water all the way to the beak. And that beak, he would just exhale and spray out all that salt as a mist. So you might see the albatross with drips of water at the very tip, and that's actually the salt water that he filtered. And it's an amazing adaptation that this bird and other certain seabirds have as well. Not all of us can drink salt water, but this is an amazing bird that we see only at Kaʻena Point, and also at a research site in Kahuku as well now. Recently we had the Blackfoot albatross at Kaʻena Point, and there's only, I believe, 3 that have arrived to Kaʻena, and they've had chicks. So it's a really awesome story to hear the albatross expand its population, call Kaʻena home. And you know, the way they make their nest on sand like behind me, they don't have a full nest as you would think any bird would make a nest in a tree. All they do is make a small mound on the sand, and it's a little indentation. That's where they lay the egg. They take turns. They're very loyal to each other, the parent albatross, and they'll take turns raising that chick. Once that chick grows and fledges, grows its real true feathers, it basically head towards Alaska and won't touch land for quite some time. Then it'll finally return back to Kaʻena to mate. They have a very, very specific mating ritual. It's dancing, a bowing of heads, and making really interesting sounds to call each other to find a mate. So this is the moli, or the albatross. Another unique species that really depends on the native plants that we have and we talked about all today. So expanding a lot of the plants in these restoration sites is only helping this species as well. So it's a full circle when we talk about putting in plants. We're not just helping one, we're helping all the other species connected in that web of life.